Major developments in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Fresh attacks in Kyiv overnight, but so far, the Ukrainian military has kept the Russian Goliath of a military from taking its capital. Experts say the war is now headed toward a stalemate where the fighting continues, but neither side advances. Russia claims victory over the key port city of Mariupol and orders Ukraine to surrender. The word from Ukraine: not a chance. The Kremlin is rejecting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's request for face-to-face meetings with Vladimir Putin. All of this comes as President Biden prepares to travel to Belgium to meet with NATO allies. We just learned he will also visit Poland, where nearly 5,000 U.S. troops have been deployed and where 2 million Ukrainian refugees have sought some sort of comfort in the light of this brutal war. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Monday, March 21st. We start with that major turning point in this bloody conflict. According to an assessment from the Institute of the Study of War, the invasion is now headed toward a bloody stalemate. After 25 days of fighting, Vladimir Putin has failed to carry out his primary objective to seize Ukraine's capital and force regime change. The analysis from war experts concludes, quote, if the war in Ukraine settles into a stalemate condition, Russian forces will continue to bomb and bombard Ukrainian cities, devastating them, killing civilians, even as Ukrainian forces impose losses on Russian attackers and conduct counterattacks of their own. This is already happening. Also, with the Russian military running out of manpower, weapons, and supplies, analysts and officials tell the Washington Post the next 2 weeks will determine if Russia can continue onward. The front lines are stagnant, and Western intelligence estimates Russia is suffering up to 1,000 casualties a day, while the Ukrainians say that number is even higher. There are now calls for the West to take advantage of this window of opportunity and step up its military support for Ukraine. Having failed to take Kyiv, senior U.S. officials tell the Wall Street Journal they believe the Kremlin is now shifting to Plan B, compelling the Ukrainian government to accept Russia's territorial claims and then to accept neutrality as well, meaning don't join NATO. Ukraine has already rejected those conditions.
Well, on Tuesday, they suggested it was a possibility. I think on all of these conditions, we're going to see movement back and forth as they continue to try to figure out a way to get together.
Yeah, often it looks like there's no way out. Let's bring in U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC, Katty Kay, columnist and associate editor for The Washington Post, David Ignatius, and former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, joins us. Good to have you all.
So, David Ignatius, there's a quote from the Times yesterday that caught my attention. It was from Ben Hodges, a former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, and he wrote this. He said, Russian generals are running out of time, ammunition, and manpower. An essential caveat to my assessment is that we, the West, led by the United States, must accelerate and expand the support we're providing to Ukraine on this scale and with a sense of urgency of the Berlin airlift. So this is where we are again. 1949. I mean, the Russians have turned back the clock. And this suggests we need to do the same and be even more urgent with our shipments into Kyiv and across Ukraine.
The urgency of shipping weapons is as clear as can be. Unfortunately, so are the limits on the weapons that we can provide. I think the debate really is over now about a no-fly zone, and pretty much over about providing MiGs, although there's still some discussion. My fear, Joe, is that as we admire and applaud and just emotionally embrace the struggle of the Ukrainian people, we're going to overstate their capacity to resist this huge army. And I think it's really important not to do that, not to get caught up in the emotion of their resistance. We're now entering the most difficult period of this war.
Right, but I need to stop you right there on your first statement. We see what's happening in Mariupol. They're moving forward. The Ukrainians are refusing to turn it over, saying that we're going to keep fighting.
They're flattening it, though.
But let's just drain all emotion out of it. I've yet to hear any U.S. commander or NATO commander, a retired general, saying that the Russians have any chance of taking Kyiv and holding it.
So they have a chance of taking it. It's just at what cost? What would be left?
And the second part of that, and holding it. Right now, they're actually fighting the best war they can fight, which is outside of the city. The second they go into a city with 2 million inhabitants, every military expert says it gets bloodier. So
others on your panel would have a better sense than I, especially Ambassador Taylor, who's been there. But I just feel that the signs are the Russians are now escalating in Ukraine. The weapons that they have to call on are devastating.
Right.
And what we know of the way they fight wars, as in Grozny, involves a level of destruction that is terrible. Resolve of the people of Kiev, like the people of Kharkiv, like the people of Mariupol, is just extraordinary. In Mariupol, there was a Russian demand early this morning to give up. Give up, or we're coming in, we're going to fight street by street. And you know what? The Ukrainians are fighting street by street, and that will happen in Kiev. So
can I ask you, David, because again, I'm really curious. We're looking at these, and you are right, people are cheering on the Ukrainians. I bet we're looking at these studies, these reports, these military assessments, and one after another says the Russians do not have enough troops in, especially with how poorly they've been going, to take Kyiv, to hold Kyiv, even to take other cities and hold those other cities, because you have, this is like Iraq squared. You have stories of women who are commanding 20 people getting in their electric vehicles, going out of town, camping in the woods for 3 days and helping take out a tank column. Then they jump back in their cars and they go back home. This is something, I mean, this actually seems like a far more daunting task than even Iraq was for the United States.
I'm not disagreeing with that, Joe, and we have some, just tales of heroism almost now on every street corner. So I'm not in any way denying that. The Russians have more force to bring to bear. They've had a chance to reorganize, and I fear that this next period is going to be even bloodier and more difficult. What I hear is that the Russians are now escalating. They're escalating in Ukraine. They're escalating at home. The level of arrests in Russia is extraordinary. The fear is that they're going to escalate also in domains, in attacks that could spread to NATO countries.
You know, Caddy, what that seems to mean right now, if it continues at this clip, if they escalate, they will kill more Ukrainian citizens. They will remain in a military stalemate, and more Russian soldiers will die. It seems like a lose-lose proposition for all sides. Not that Putin cares, but at some point, enough Russian mothers may.
Enough Russian mothers may, but I think David's right. The potential for escalation is still very powerful on the Russian side. I had a conversation with a couple of European diplomats this weekend. There are real concerns that they use 1 and possibly 2 tactical nuclear weapons in the course of the next couple of weeks within Ukraine, specifically targeted at those military supply lines. If they can stop the supply lines...
And what's the impact of that when they use nuclear weapons? Does NATO stand on the sidelines? Because I've got to tell you, I don't think they do.
Well, Jens Stoltenberg yesterday did not set any red lines. At the moment, the message out of NATO seems to be the only red line is an attack on NATO itself, is Article 5. But he was very evasive about chemicals. He was not asked about tactical nuclear weapons used inside Ukraine, if God forbid that were to happen. But it's just a demonstration of how Russia can still escalate. And all at the same time, you've got huge pressure being put on those NATO countries in terms of refugees. And if that's a tactic as well that the Russians are using, you get millions of Ukrainians putting pressure in Poland, putting pressure in other NATO countries, and you hold out the stalemate. I agree, everybody's cheering on the Ukrainians, and they've done a phenomenal job, and the Russian army has performed badly. But it's not over yet.
Well, no, it's not over. Again, I guess, Amico, the question is, how do the Russians win? If you want to even use that word, you look at the numbers, you look at the 40 million people they're fighting, you look at the resistance. I don't think there's a general in the United States, active or retired, that would say, oh, yeah, I could go into Russia and take Kyiv and take Ukraine over. Not at this point.
I think the concern might be that Russia might have a very evolving definition of winning that doesn't involve any types of boundaries, whether it be war crimes or anything else. They practically announced war crimes over the weekend. Ambassador Bill Taylor, what are the options for NATO, which hasn't collectively done anything yet? I mean, there have been nations that have done things on their own, offered support. When you talk about Article 5, isn't the collapse of Ukraine, isn't that a threat to NATO? Doesn't that completely blow up NATO's security?
Because Ukraine is very important to NATO. Yeah. Ukraine is very important to the West. And it's very important that Putin lose. It's very important, or at least he not win. That Ukraine maintain its independence, its sovereignty, most of its territory. This is going to be important for a post-war recovery. It needs to have the people and the resources to rebuild. It needs to come out of this intact, basically intact, and it is an interest. It is an interest for NATO and NATO countries. It is also demonstrating the importance of and the abilities of the Ukrainian people and military. Ukraine is an asset, really, for NATO, and they ought to recognize how important that is. Maybe this summit will recognize that.
What will be the factors they'll have to take into consideration at this summit?
So they'll have to consider that if in the worst case, if President Putin somehow does what I don't think he will do, he can't hold Ukraine. But in that case, then that moves Russian troops to the borders of NATO nations. And we're already responding. NATO's already responding to that by moving forces into Poland and other Eastern European. So that changes the force posture.
David, so if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine, do you think there's a European country in NATO or a United States politician that is going to be able to withstand the pressure from the public, not only in America but also in Europe, to actually go in and move in the Ukraine? Into Ukraine? Because I can tell you right now, you look at the polls, they have swifted wildly in favor of no-fly zones, in favor of the United States doing more. That's here. Caddy talks about the visceral reaction in Europe. A nuclear weapon set off on the European continent. It's just, I'm just saying that right now, that or chemical weapons will not be acceptable to the American people or to Europeans to just sit back and go, oh, well, now they're using weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. We'll just sit back and let this continue.
Well, wars are not managed by polls, thank goodness, because polls go up and down, and military strategy has to be consistent and continuous. I think that the effort has been from the beginning to signal to the Russians that what the limits of this game are. One limit is not 1 inch of NATO territory will be attacked, and they've said that again and again, and they mean it. A second limit, less clearly specified, is non-use of nuclear weapons, and there's great concern that a tactical nuclear weapon might be used in a demonstration by Putin.
So
I'm ready to do this.
Does President Biden need to come out today? Does the head of NATO need to come out today? Say, make no mistake of it, using tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons is a red line that cannot be crossed. And if you cross that line, we will not hesitate, as Barack Obama did. We will come in and we will destroy your ability to do that inside of Ukraine.
So I think there's a feeling, Joe, that announcing red lines in advance is usually a mistake. You don't want to, say in advance what you're going to do and restrict your options. In this case, we do need to deter Russia. All of our efforts to persuade them from October to the date the invasion began not to do it failed.
So how do we do that?
Well, more important are the military-to-military conversations that we hope are taking place between the Pentagon and the Russian military. because announcing it on television that this is a red line doesn't necessarily make it a red line.
They don't have to announce it on television, but they can pick up the phone and get a message to Russia. If you use tactical weapons, you know.
Stoltenberg was asked about it three or four different ways yesterday on chemicals, and he would not say it was a red line.
Aren't they already past a red line? I mean, they're killing babies, civilians, maternity hospitals. They're flattening a strategic city, Mariupol. They're telling the people they have a certain number of hours to leave before there'll be military tribunals. People will be shot in the head.
They're kidnapping Ukrainians. They're dragging them into Russia.
What red line would even look serious at this point? I think whether, it applies to NATO rules or not, Ambassador Taylor, right now, Europe and the West looks like it can't help these people. And I think even, people across America, I think we have polls that we'll show later, but there is a growing interest in helping these people, in doing something that would stop this brutality. Red lines at this point are far from behind us.
Red lines are behind us, and the brutality that we see it's gut-wrenching. It's beyond words. You can't even express the horror that we see on that. And there are a lot of ideas now on maybe it's some subset of NATO. Maybe it's not NATO as a whole. Maybe it's individual nations that will pull together and do something along these lines.
Like Zelensky was asking.
Zelensky's talked about this, and others have talked about this.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.